My goal for this year was to challenge myself. And I started with Fiberchats Shetland lace knit along that is taking place right now on Ravelry in Fiberchats group. And I welcome you to join it and learn some new techniques for you. But I wanted to learn new things about knitting. I wanted to learn new techniques about knitting. And so I'm continuing this series called Tips and Tricks on Becoming a Better Knitter. And I want to invite you to join me on this journey. Today, I have two guests, Olga Jazzy and Monique Boonstra. Both are very established designers and teachers in their field. So I hope you'll enjoy these mini interviews. Please let me know how you're liking this series in the comments, and please consider subscribing. Thank you. So the idea was, how like a lot of people need
If you would like
things,
to
right?
join
So you have
me
people
on the Shetland lace knit along,
into
please
like the
join
most
Ravelry group
sophisticated
called
things, the most
Fiberchats,
difficult things,
and
and
check out
they're
the
looking for this
announcements section
challenge, and
in
they
that
want the
group.
pattern to be super difficult,
We're
right?
doing a lot
And
of
then you
Zoom
have people
sessions
who
and a
look
lot of
at the
fun
knitting as like
activities.
complete meditation.
So I hope you'll join me
they
there.
want to knit what
Thank
they
you.
know. They want to, and of course we change between the things, right? So if you take me, I want to knit something that my brain is completely like on fire, and then I want to knit a beanie in stockinette stitch that like I don't even have to think about it, right? So like
brain just like resting, yeah,
right.
just hands.
So it's like we have these sort of different stages of our life as a knitter. So the idea is like why some people, like I see people who just learn how to knit a few months ago, and they doing stuff that I'm still sort of sitting and waiting until I graduate to that level, right? And then you have people who knitted all their lives and they haven't even heard about certain techniques, right? So I was thinking of putting together this series of talking to people who actually teach knitting, teach different techniques or 9 different techniques, right? And to see like what's in their opinion makes someone a better knitter and how can we become better knitters. So the first episode that I did was more philosophical discussion, right? Of like what scares people, how they can overcome their insecurities, how they can learn something new for themselves. The second episode was concentrated more on the beginner knitters, like what tips and tricks beginners can learn to become better knitters, right? So such as like reading your knitting, reading the fabric that you create. But then I was thinking about you. And the thing is about you that all your patterns look extremely complicated. They look extremely difficult, and they might not be very difficult like once you get into that, right?
Not difficult at all.
Right, but it requires that trust in the designer. Like you have to follow line by line until you get the idea, because like most of your patterns repeat the same sequence, right? So like once you get the sequence, once you get the idea of how this design works, it becomes easy.
In the level of having a repetitive pattern, there's a lot of variables that are included when especially it includes shaping. So some of the harder, complicated, textured stitch patterns that you see, like in some of my work, that implementation of shaping with that stitch pattern requires an additional thought. And before putting it on the paper, I try to weigh in the options. Is it going to be worth knitters' time with the outcome that they will learn something, but will it be worth it as an outcome? Is the detail worth having in the design? So a lot of difficult stitch patterns, you see very minimal shaping because I want people to have fun and yes, learn something new, but I want it to become very good for your short-term memory purpose where you can read the pattern, not understand it. If you follow it verbatim, try it 1, 2, 3 times, work a couple repeats, and you're like, oh, I don't need the rest of the pattern anymore. Because they are practicing their, you know how they're saying now that the studies that a lot of this small needlework is actually great if you have predisposed to Alzheimer's, or like keep the Alzheimer's away. So anything related with the brain, it's a repetitive motion, but you keep practicing the short-term memory. And I want people to enjoy it, but small increments at a time, you know, without putting on a challenge. So going back to some of these ideas, I find that the most complicated patterns, believe it or not, are not the maneuvers or the techniques, because those can be mimicked and can be read over and reminded of. But it is the attention span that sometimes a pattern would require for you to put in the project. I would say, okay, I have this pattern that utilizes short rows without any wrapping. So you have a purposeful holes, and you do a horizontal pleat, or sometimes it's also called a tuck. And you do that concurrently, you know, it alternates over and over. But the complexity of the texture would blow your mind how it looks to execute. But then you would look at something even more elaborate looking, and maybe it will be like 10 stitches only, and also utilizing short rows. But it is the part where you cannot phase out and just continue working ribbing or continue working stockinette. You have to pay attention to the pattern, because it's not as, like, sometimes it takes longer for your attention span to the pattern, so you can record it in your brain.
Right.
And continuously going. If it is in your brain, then you have to keep referring to your fabric, you know, learn how to read your knitting and actually see which stage of the pattern you're in. So to me, more of that is taking place within the garment or accessory, the fabric that you're creating, more complex I rate that in my worldview of knitting techniques. So you have techniques, you have the things that you execute, but it's the attention span that is the hardest. We have such busy lives, we have noise from TVs, computers, your device, whichever you use, and the noise that comes from it, you know, you get very preoccupied. You sometimes think of it as you are knitting, and you have to completely distract yourself from that, so you will be completely immersed in this part of knitting, or you will mess up. So the attention span requirement, when there's a lot of it needed, I put those patterns as advanced.
How do you decide like what's appropriate for a beginner knitter? How do you convince somebody to challenge themselves and do something the next level, right?
You know, there are different techniques out there, and from based on my own experience and just as a knitter myself as well, you have this progression scale where you start from garter stitch. And what I've discovered is that it's not, it is driven by desire of what you want to make. I believe growing up, you know, in Eastern Europe, still in the Soviet bloc, we didn't have much to go and buy. So we would see a picture and like, okay, I love that. I want to recreate that. So it's driven by the outcome. So how is by trial and error, taking some classes, reading some books, trying to dig up an information, also asking around, because that time you did not, you know, have like much classes. You just ask grandma, ask your mom, how would you do this? Or ask your friends, how would you replicate that? But the desire to possess and own and wear that garment is one of the things that driven me as a beginner. Like, you know, I wanted to have something that I could not just buy or even save up and buy because it wasn't available. But in knitting now as a designer, I am quite often driven not just by designer to wear, because yes, a lot of us are selfish knitters, and this is something you want to own, maybe you cannot afford, or still, for me, it's to create something that needs to exist, because the pattern for this does not exist yet, that I can just purchase, knit it, and buy it, and wear it, and love it. So the techniques that will be involved for me now as a designer, I want to teach, if I'm putting this as a pattern, what are the most fine points for the knitter to enjoy? Is this very simple fabric? Yes. But what would be the learning point for achieving that, and why does this design needs to exist? So this is where I go into the technique field, and I try to see which the beneficial points would be very pleasing and refined details, such as what type of cast on would you use, what type of edging would you use, how would you shape this, would this need like bust darts, or would this need ribbing, and would you need to switch out the needle sizes, or what is the difference between the main fabric and the ribbon? We all know that the ribbon is a very loose stitch pattern, so always have to go down a needle size.
Right.
A lot of this, for the simplest designs, I try to not to dress it up, I try to refine it so there is a need for it to exist, because in the ocean of the patterns, free and paid, that are available right now, how does your design to stand out? Does it need to exist? All this time, investment, yes, maybe people are really big fans of your work, and they just like your personally or your personality, but I am driven by something that is hopefully is going to last. And that still echoes my mom's notion, like, why do you want to be like anybody else, when I wanted to fit in high school.
Right.
So for me to have something in my wardrobe that I have not just made by my hands, but also it came out of my brain, is a moment of pride. But at the same time, if people enjoy it and they learn a technique or two, that means that I have met my goal. And why does this design needed to be created, and what do you needed to exist?
Well, I mean, what do you think when you think about your design process, right? Do you feel like, because you're coming up with new concepts, you're coming up with new patterns all the time, like things that, again, don't exist, right? That's why you're creating it. Do you feel like you're learning something with every project?
Oh, absolutely. The teacher is ever the student. That would be ridiculous to admit that. Yeah, it's like when I was learning English, even though it's like my third language, my teacher once said, never can be sure of your knowledge that you know everything. So and in a funny correlation that we are like humans and we communicate using a language, so we are carriers of it. The same comes with knitting. We are carriers of the craft. We're carriers of these techniques, and a lot of them, they have developed culturally. So whichever technique was taught or acquired or learned or taught by somebody, I am definitely most possibly have not encountered it yet, because we are all creatives. You can be just a knitter, you can be just, not put in a designing patterns. We are still makers. We still think. And the way that we can think is actually can lead to development of new ideas or new maneuvers. And the funny part about it is, because it's like archaic languages, some things have disappeared over the time and then they reappear. So all they have, and excuse me, is just a new name to them. So
Right.
sometimes you have this type of yarn over called this thing as you know it, and then there's a different type of yarn over named this, a different name, but in essence they're identical. It's just how they came to discovery.
Well, lately I've been noticing, so the way we learn how to knit, right? It's very Eastern European kind of technique.
Yeah.
And it results like, so there is this, what Russians and the Soviets called the grandma style knitting, right? It results in stitches that you have to learn like how the stitch has to face, and depending on that, depending on what you're doing, you knit differently, like in garter stitch versus stockinette stitch, right? Sometimes it's from the front leg of the stitch, sometimes it's through the back loop. And I was doing couple tutorials and people seem to be like flabbergasted by that, and they're like, it's inconsistent, right? Because the stitch turns differently in different ways. And to me, it's like easy and intuitive. There are so many different knitting techniques do you feel like people should be encouraged to try different ways of knitting and find something that maybe not been taught to them as a child, and perhaps that's going to become their new favorite knitting? Like, I'm now fascinated with the Portuguese style knitting. I never heard of it growing up, but now I'm like toying with that, right? What's your opinion on that? What's your opinion on different knitting
I
styles?
think it would be quite narrow-minded for people to admit that, hey, there's one way to knit, because once again, we're carriers of the craft. The way we were taught, the way we learn, it's a link, whoever taught you, your grandmother, your mother. So it's an heirloom knowledge that was passed down to you and has been worked as a generation. And I think you have to always look at the knitting techniques, the styles. Just because it looks wrong, it does not mean it is wrong. It is just another method, and it is a creative way of achieving the same fabric. So in a way, I would say that it is a cultural specificity, whichever region you came from. There is a Norwegian purl, the people the way purl, and there are sometimes options that is information not available to you. So as you call it, grandma style of purling, it has been coined to be called a combination knitting in the United States, in part thanks to Annie Modizit, who have written several blog posts about it, basically created a crumb trail for us to know that this is what it identifies as. And back in the day, Grandparina Kathy, she has created a whole chart where she placed English style knitting, which is not a proper type, but the ones a way how the patterns are written. And she created a chart with the conversions were happening. How would you execute this working at combination style? Because she has learned from her mother, grandmother, and we all learn from our surroundings. We all absorb it because that's part of our culture. Now, as you grow and as you emerge into this vast world of knitting, oh wow, there's so many, like Portuguese style, the ways of holding the yarn. And why is it called Portuguese style? Because when you go to Peru, everybody knits the same way, over the shoulder. So it may have different names to it, but there is no, I think when it comes to knitting, you always have to come with an open mind. And it's not a competition even among the knitters. Pointing out somebody else's mistakes or pointing out that something is doing something different. I have taught beginners a long time ago, and whenever people would come into the yarn store when I was working part-time, I would be very cautious about approaching them, because a lot of people will be purling the combination style inadvertently, and when they would knit on the next row, all the knit stitches will be knit through the back loop, not through the back loop, but like twisted.
Right.
And they would create sweaters and scarves. So I don't want to hurt people's feelings, because that is how they were taught. It does not produce the fabric, because several students, or not students, but several people came up and it's like, why does my fabric doesn't look like the picture? What is wrong with it? So they want to know what is so different. And I think, as anything, it's the curiosity, it's the drive, the desire to know more about knitting and learn about knitting, because their techniques are in abundance, but it's just to have an open channel and the bandwidth throughout the day,
Right.
how much you want to learn. So for me, as much as my schedule permits, I would tell you, curiosity and research drives a lot of my aspirations for making things that may look different, because I want them to look different. I want them to stand out, but I'm using all the same techniques everybody else does, because I'm not reinventing how we knit. No, I just take some techniques, use them in a different application, combine them. Quite often I like to simplify them, because I'm one knitter, and also have to have, that's my teacher a point, that I want to have them as some learning point where even however small, people end up with something that they're proud of wearing, and also are not too burdened by learning like too much. But again, you have to have an open mind for it. If you just, as you said, but have you can do garter stitch shawls and sweaters and everything simple, so you can relax and zone out as you knit and you watch TV, or just to have an opportunity to give your brain a break. And then as you, I don't know, maybe grow more interested in other techniques and other projects, then you slowly graduate towards the techniques that maybe look different. And it's like, doesn't have to be an ambitious color work project, but just something different. And, if it sets up a challenge to you, it also trains your brain, like you tried once, and then it is such a reward. It's such a high when you finally finish something and you learn and it looks great. And because it's like a dangling the carrot, what else can I learn? And you always follow your heart because you do it with your hands, and it's the energy that you invest. It's not just the yarn, it's your time, it's your emotional energy that you invest into your knitting, and then the outcome, whether it's for you or whether it's for a gift, it's quite rewarding. So I definitely say, like, keep an open mind.
Well, when you deal with people who like new to your patterns, right? I mean, we all make mistakes. The sort of the thought train wanders somewhere and boom, you don't know where you are in your knitting, or you dropped the stitches, or you did something wrong. This more complex patterns, that's more bound to happen. How do you tell people to prevent mistakes, to help themselves figure out where they are in the pattern and deal with mistakes when they happen?
So one of the biggest lessons I would ever teach people is like trying, even a beginner or an advanced knitter, the biggest thing that you can learn is to read your own fabric. And from the suggestions or the tips that I can advise is to echo the most admirable person, who is Elizabeth Zimmerman. And she said, admire your work very frequently. And also that's one of the best ways of spotting any mistakes, because you would pull it up, put it on the needle where you can stretch it out, you turn it inside out to foresee for any inconsistency or irregularities. Or when I was in art school, we did a funny thing where they told us to turn our work upside down. So that's another way of spotting any irregularities. But when it comes to clarity of pattern writing, I have been doing this for 16 years now, and every single pattern I write, I still try to improve my writing to be as precise, not too wordy, but to the point. So if you have to read it over and over again, you actually still get it, and it's still very pertinent. And a lot of techniques that I do, if they're new or if they're quite imperative into within the frame of the pattern, I write them out very thoughtfully.
Right.
Sometimes when, because of the medium of the videos has been so prevalent, I would include a video tutorial that I filmed. There are more words in there, but also as a teacher, I know some people need to hear it, some people need to read it, some people need to try it, and just trying to provide all of those mediums for a person to absorb. But to avoid mistakes, that's one of the things, again, about the attention span. You can pace yourself and stop yourself from making a mistake. But, of all things, I have found for myself, it's really work in the good lighting. Some
I
people prefer like dark, like black yarn, it's not very well lit, use ebony or carbon needles and it's black on black. And it's a little bit of a masochism that you can describe, but you want to also work on the projects that are, if they're hard, if they require attention span, maybe when you have a better frame of mind, or in a quiet place. Some of us, you like a louder environment, like you have TV or music playing, just relaxing and knitting. Everybody is different, so everybody will find their moment of zen, because to me it's meditation. I like it to be completely quiet, and to me it helps me focus. But if the pattern already becomes repetitive, then I can turn something on, or do
I
something.
actually like really agree with that, because I noticed that if I'm knitting Shetland lace, it has to be with the perfect light. It has to be in certain spot of my house where the light is from the northern side and not blinding, and just
And wear dark, like wear clothing if you're knitting, or put a blanket or something that actually has the contrast.
right.
So if
Well,
there's a,
are you a fan of like lifelines, markers, things
I
that
do use a lot of markers when I need to. For example, the repeat is very wide, stitches wise, so I would place markers every repeat until I don't need them anymore. As for the lifelines, I don't knit as much lace as you do. When I did, I would, I use whatever thread you can, or just the dental floss. I'm not a stranger to ripping out or dropping stitches down and to fixing them, because to me that's something I would do. I would cut my knitting off if I needed to, and then graft it together. To me, that's quicker than ripping it out and re-knitting it, because I know now from years of practice, um, you have to understand how the flow of stitches goes, and it's easier sometimes just to graft it that way. But lifelines, I just have not encountered needing them as much. To me, if you have dropped the stitch and you continued the pattern, right, what I would usually do, I would spot where the mistake was, and I would take the needle and I would put the stitches while they're still in the fabric onto the knitting needle, and then I'll rip up everything on top. It's just an additional time to put a lifeline. I know as a beginner, it's actually a great thing to have. You just be aware that it will require time to. It's a There are some needles. Actually, I have some like right here, like Chiago, and
right?
I think
Yes,
some higher ones. They have that little hole. That is the tool for the tool to come into. These are interchangeables. So if you have to run a lifeline, for example, on the last round or last row of your repeat, just feed the dental floss through that and like somehow tie it up, and just work your last round and then untie it at the end, and that's how your lifeline just stays. Not in the ways of cutting corner, but try to save time
right.
because I'm a pretty fast knitter, and quite often if this is something small, I just like rip it out and burn it quickly again. Because
Well,
going back and forth with these tiny stitches on there, it just can be annoying,
right.
but it's just me.
We're starting new year now, and
Mhm.
I'm determined to become a better knitter this year. So I'm already thinking about all the things I want to try this year that I haven't tried yet. Do you have any plans for this year to learn something new?
I have done some techniques, the ones that I have practiced and before, and I would not be so great at them. And I do love wearing them sometimes. So for me, it's a desire to create something, to achieve something. And for the techniques, there are a lot of Estonian techniques that are absolutely fascinating. And because how they have evolved culturally, but also how they were not disseminated so widely and so easily. My friend, designer Alex Birch, recently put out a book, Modern Traditions, and there are so many techniques in there. I really want to learn some of them. But what is also funny is that, based on experience, the things that we have surrounding us, or also the things that you have knit before, I can look at them and I can visualize, okay, this is how you would do this in my head. Then I open the book, I'm like, oh, it's done. I visualize this executing one way in my head without, actually knowing how to do it, but it's actually done differently. So I'm like, which one do I do? Which one do I follow? So breaking up the norm and, getting out of your comfort zone is one of the biggest drives to learning something new. I do want to practice actually more of the color work. However, I grew up and my mom made these giant sweater dresses. They're like late 90s, where a lot of color work, sometimes 3 colors per row. I'm not going that daring, but I have not knit true color work or larger pieces in so long. And I want to get better at it, because every single time I try to do something, I see my gauge is wonky. I have not practiced it enough. I would do color work combined method, where I do one color in continental style and the second color throwing English style. And you have to get a hand of it. And I remember my mom always knitted it, like picking up one color and putting one down. And this is how I learned from her. And gosh, that was so tedious, and it was so.
Well, it's also like twists all the yarns all the time. So
Yes, but in combined knitting, you put one color on one side, the other color on the other, and unless you want them to, they'll never cross over. They just go parallel next to each other. You trap the very long floats. I know how to do color work on the right side, and I also know how to purl back and color work while trapping floats. I have designed called Ompa shawl and a stole. I enjoyed. I made 3. I really enjoyed it. But the thing is, after I have not done it for quite a while, I find I'm rusty. So I want to challenge myself to do something in color work again, because as anything in knitting, it requires practice. And when you let the technique sort of be on a precipice or not revisited as often. So I'm started the new year this year with actually knit along with my local yarn store, Fiber Space. I just designed a column color work when calling it Connect. It is using 3 colors of yarn and the interlocked crosses, continuing my crosses theme. And what is fun about it is that you have a perception that almost 3 colors are worth per round, but it's not. It's a very, very unusual perception and then execution, but you only do 2 colors. So something small like a cowl, and hopefully I'll graduate to a sweater this year. I feel a little bit of envy how a lot of color works that are so elaborate are popping, and I would love to wear one. I don't own a true Fair Isle sweater that I have knitted. I have a friend who have gifted me one, and I worn it to shreds, what I can say. And it is very elaborate, and I want to give my skills a boost, so that way I can maybe learn something new, also hone the skill that I already have, and ended up having something that I haven't had in my wardrobe for a while.
well, perhaps
How
we'll meet
about
again
you?
at the end of the year and we'll compare what we learn.
Oh yeah. You also inadvertently learn a lot of different techniques that I have not possibly worked with before. So whichever comes my way, I'm always receptive, because discovery is the reward of your curiosity. All of that is what keeps you going. I love the excitement of it. And I know some people would say, oh, it's only knitting. It is like you engineer yourself. It's that light bulb moment that comes in your brain. This is how these 2 things work in correlation with everything else. And that how it progresses and how it arrives at the point like, wow, this is magic.
Do you have any advice when it comes to people who like about to start knitting Shetland lace, what they should pay attention to? Like, what do you think is the skill sets that they need to develop?
Recognizing their stitches. because when I teach a class, I've told it in the other videos too, it's like building with Lego blocks. You have a limited number of stitch types, and the knit togethers and the yarn over, those are most common. Let me say it differently, the decreases and the increases. And when you recognize those, then and when you take the overall look of the pattern part in your head, then it becomes a bit easier, but you have to do a lot of practice and a lot of knitting to recognize it where you are and which pattern you're working on, because with Shetland lace, it's most often more than 3 or 4. And with the shawl behind you, it's just 2 or 1 per row, and then it changes, and then you have to repeat it. But with when you get to a bit more difficult, it's more like 3 or 4 things happening in one row, and then the next row it changes again. So
Well, you know what? I want to mention this shawl that behind me. So this is Little Secret, and I knitted Little Secret twice. And I actually like that, the fact that I have both of them, because I can see how far I progressed just by looking at those two shawls. Talk to me about your journey as a Shetland lace knitter. Like, do you still improve? When you look back at some of the stuff that you knitted years ago, do you see the difference that you made in your knitting?
Yes and no. I am at the point now where I'm more into more intricate, so more things happen in one row. But I'm also getting a bit more lazy, and I want to do just simple stuff. So yeah, I've done it all. I've done light yarn and fat yarn and thin yarn and super thin yarn, and mostly because I knit for other people, the shawls disappear. So sometimes I can't compare it with what I'm doing now because I don't have the original anymore. And because I knit every day for hours and hours and a little bit extra on Sundays, I have a very steady hand. So technically, they will probably look the same, but it's more a thing about color or construction, or now even for the coming year, it will be finer and finer. So yeah, to compare, not much difference, but I try to work with more colors and be a bit more intricate or play with construction stuff.
How does one become a better knitter? What do you think it means to be a better knitter?
Oh. Well, you asked me that a while ago, and I thought about it until today. And the first thing that came up in my mind was, why do you want to become a better knitter? Aren't you happy with what you're making already? Is there something you think you're lacking or missing in your work? And I thought about some, well, in short, about 5 things. Is it about efficiency? Is it about result? Is it about quality? Is it about enjoyment? Or is it about speed? Because most people, and myself sometimes included, want to be quicker, more speedy, and so you can maybe go on to the next thing. But I don't think it's about that. I think it's about the quality of your work, and maybe that depends on the quality of your materials. Because most of us start with basic needles from the local yarn store and basic yarn. And some people knit socks for 40 years, and there's nothing wrong with that. But others want to challenge themselves and end up knitting Shetland lace. And that some things you want to do require other materials and can be sometimes a bit more expensive, but yeah, I think when you want to be a better knitter, I think it's about making it so you're growing in your knit skills, not as much as in quality that comes with getting the skills, but I think it's about knowing your techniques and putting in the hours and results better quality. And maybe that's not about speed, because I don't really knit very fast. I just knit a lot, so I can compensate that. And yeah, but I think it's about quality of your knitting.
Well, it's funny because like I often bring up example of people who knit socks and hats all their life, right? But on the other hand, I'm like, I was terrified of socks for the longest time. And then the few times that I actually knitted socks, I was very dissatisfied with the way they looked. And then I met Professor Pearl in real life, and he brought me a little gift. He brought me a pair of socks, and it was absolute perfection.
Mm-hmm.
They looked, it was like amazing, right? And I realized how inadequate my quality of socks was to what he produced.
Yeah, but he has put in the hours, and
Right.
that's another thing too, because when you put in the hours, you started recognizing pain points. Like for socks, it's better to use something with a little bit of nylon in it, so when you wear it, you don't wear them out in 2 days,
Right.
and that the color doesn't fade, or that, and that has to do with quality again, because you have to sometimes invest a bit to improve on quality and therefore become a better knitter. Because yeah, to be honest, the first time I bought myself a skein of silk, it was $53. I was terrified to use it because it was so expensive, but I paid more attention. The quality of the yarn gave me a quality of knitting too, so it doesn't mean you have to spend money, but I became a better knitter because of the yarn was so expensive. I paid more attention to what I was doing. The yarn with your project. It's not all about color, because most people know I'm not about color, but more about the quality of your yarn, because I would personally rather knit a dress in silk than in wool, because wool will uh, uh, be felting and wear, tear and stretch, and silk will drape, but it's stronger, so it will last longer.
Yeah, and I think you like touched on a very important point, that when we knit, if we are critical of our knitting, if we are paying attention to what we're trying to achieve, right? If we concern about the quality, if it's not just mindless knitting, you are by default becoming a better knitter. The more aware you are of what's happening.
I'm sorry, I don't really need to brag, but even Shetland lace can be mindless knitting for me too, because I'm so familiar with the patterns that I can do a row and still watch my Danish television series. So, but it's, yeah, I think it's about the quality, because the quality will last longer, and then you know when you're knitting that it won't be in the bin next year. And you can give it away as a gift very easily, because you know it will last.
Is there like, if somebody asks you, like, what are the few important tips about knitting Shetland lace, where would you go? Like, what would first thing that come to mind?
Well, like you have with Minoka mesh shawl, it doesn't really automatically has to be with very, very fine yarn. You can start with fingering weight, or a little bit lighter, or heavy lace, and that's still okay. I mean, Hap shawl has lace, and that's done in the fingering weight. So as spindrift or the 2-ply jumper weight works very well. You just have to adjust the needle size so it doesn't get one tangled mess and hard work. So yeah, the thing is with Shetland lace, for most people, it takes a long time. You're working on it every day and every night, and maybe skip a night or two or a weekend, but after 2 months, you're probably still working on it. So the thing is, when you buy a sweater quantity of yarn, you will spend $100 or $200, and then you have a sweater, you can wear it all winter. And yeah, I think it's terrible, but the terrible thing with finer yarns is that it's not available in local yarn shops, because it doesn't provide them with sufficient income. Because when I buy a cone of fine lace, I won't be back in another 6 months.
Right.
So, and it might be very expensive relatively, but you're buying yarn by the mile and not per 400 meters or even DK or something like that. So it looks expensive to do, it looks difficult to do, but I think it's worth it because you're pulling yourself up to a higher level of knitting. You'll be very proud to wear it because it's something that the local yarn store doesn't have, so probably your friends won't have it either. And then you walk around with a very beautiful lace shawl in a nice color that suits you. And then you get a little bit of attention, and that's always very nice. And it will last longer because it's elegant and chic, and it will be giving you a luxurious feeling when you wear it.
Let's talk about practical tips for lace knitters. How to hold your needles, what to use to save some heartache along the way. Talk to me about like the basic tips.
Okay. Holding your needles. Well, yeah, if I'm a traditional knitter in the sense that I hold my needles the same way as a Shetland knitter does. I work very close to the tips to make my movements very small. Like I said, I might be a bit quicker than the average knitter, but I've seen sock knitters knitting way faster than me, so that's not the point.
Well,
Oh, right.
why do people hold needles? Like, why do Shetlanders hold needles to very close to the tips? Like, what does it do?
It's more control, and because then the movements are very small.
Right.
And when the movements are small, you don't get in the way of ergonomics, like stressing your hands or your wrist, because the only thing you're doing is like, boop, boop, boop. It's like a sewing machine. With this hand, I press the stitches forward, like the feet of a sewing machine presses the fabric forward. And with this, I do tuk, tuk, tuk. Not that fast, but usually.
And it's also like I noticed that when I hold my needles closer to the tip, it helps me control those stitches that trying to run away, because there is less chance of your stitch slipping away from your hands.
Yeah.
You can,
Well,
like,
I see American knitters, and they have the yarn over here, over this finger, and then the needles are here, and she's holding them like this. And then the yarn is all, and that gives tension, that's okay. But I want, it's not wrong, let me stress that, it's not wrong. But what I want is closer to the needle tips, because I need to pull down the fabric with these needles instead of holding them. I need to pull down the fabric so my needle gets in, so I can decrease. The yarn over doesn't matter, it goes anyway, so.
Right. I mean, and it's something that comes with a bit of a trial and error, but it's not that easy to put the needle into the two stitches to knit them together.
No.
When
You
when
need a really pointy needle. And let me stretch this also. Two very important tips. First, when I knit lace, I have the yarn in a bowl or on the couch next to me, and I pull out, not from the center, because I need every twist it has, another sore point for some knitters. I pull out a yard, and sometimes a bit more, because then I can knit the whole row in one go.
Right.
I don't get lost halfway because I have to pull the yarn or get distracted by the television. I can knit, 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 knit. And then I check my knitting, return, pull another yard, and on and on. And the second thing that is most important is never, 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 ever start the first stitch of your row with a new yarn. Always go a few stitches in, and then the row, the side of the row stays intact, the side of your shawl. And when they're in lace, there's always somewhere a knit together or a decrease with 3, and that is the point where you start with the new yarn. And then wait, don't make a knot, don't double, always wait till after washing and blocking. So you need to leave a tail of, let's say, 8 inches. Then it won't get lost with the rest. When
Right.
you block it, it doesn't get pulled off. And then after it's blocked and dressed and everything is dry, then you can sew in the ends.
Yeah.
Those are my rules, and I stick with them.
If you would like to join me on the Shetland Lace Knit Along, please join Ravelry group called Fiberchats and check out the announcements section in that group. We're doing a lot of Zoom sessions and a lot of fun activities. So I hope you'll join me there. Thank you.